I will jump right in, and because I will not be part of the conversation, I'm going to aim to, I'm going to start this clock so I can achieve that aim, to air towards 15 and 20 minutes and leave time for Q&A while I am here for today. I wanted to quickly add a couple of thank yous first to Karen Barkey and Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, who have supported this project as we've tried to get it off the ground in the years that I've been here at Columbia. So that, I also want to thank Aubrey Hendricks, who has co-taught a course that is sort of the anchor of this project with me, and is a visiting scholar here at Columbia, as well as to Joseph Blankholm, a soon-to-be graduating PhD student in religion, and Laura McTighe, who were the TAs for the first two iterations of this course, and really I learned as much from there. They were, in fact, to extend that interdisciplinary conversation, I am, in fact, more of a humanist than a social scientist, but I had two amazing ethnographers working with me both during the first and second iteration of the course, who helped us sort of model that interdisciplinary through the teaching team for the Religions of Harlem class. And then also I want to acknowledge just my colleague Courtney Bender, who teaches a course on religion in New York City more broadly, and I've learned significantly and tried to utilize some of the resources she's already tried out in her course in developing this project in class. So mapping religion in Upper Manhattan from the Negro Renaissance to the New Harlem. What I want to do very quickly is give you a sense of what the project is, anchored around this recurring course that's offered every 2 years. Talk a little bit about this idea of mapping Upper Manhattan, why this particular phrase, and talk about the primary sort of interdisciplinarity being between history and ethnography, or the past and the present, and Harlem being a particular fecund space and place for thinking about how the past and present converge through things like memory and oral history, a range of different methodological approaches, and then think out loud as a way of opening up to Q&A through what we've learned, the mistakes we've made, if I'm more clear, in the first couple times of teaching this course. Okay, is that clear? So first, the project. As I've said, project started in 2010, spring of 2010, when Professor Hendricks and Aubrey and I first taught the course. This website is, in fact, a reimagining of an issue of the NAACP's Crisis that was designed by our graduate student for a website that would run alongside the course. In addition to the course, we had the following year a series of undergrad and graduate researchers who were following their own particular research interests to produce a series of blogs. And then more recently, we've formally partnered with the Schomburg to think about some programming, as well as to ways in which to highlight their religious, whatever the category of religion becomes an umbrella for, the particular resources they have. In fact, the Schomburg, under a previous administration, at one time purchased a portable microfiche machine, where they imagined themselves going out to churches and religious communities and helping them document their own history, which produced its own set of challenges and opportunities. Some churches signed up, other churches were less invested, and now there is an untapped archive at the Schomburg that provides a sort of wealth of historical resources yet to be unpacked. So I should say, in addition to the archival goals or overview of the project that were the ethnographic component, and it's part ethnographic and part, I guess, what you would call digital humanities. We wanted to send students out in the field, but not in the sense that we were training them more formally as social scientists. We equipped many of them, and now we don't even have to do the work with iPhones and Androids and all the like, but with the first iteration, we made available little digital cameras and videos where they could go out and do sort of interviewing and photographic work. And the idea was to provide a rich documentary story of the contemporary landscape, and then to invite folks who are more invested in a historical project to provide some of the past. And so here, what you see is a reimagining of the NAACP, its publication, which came to popularity in the early 1920s. In fact, in the poem you see anchoring there, lifts up another one of the less explicitly stated but hopes that we had for the course, to invite students to think about the relationship between the university where they were matriculating and the immediate community surrounding them. So this is a poem by Langston Hughes, and it's probably difficult to read. It says, "So we stand here on the edge of hell in Harlem and look out on the world and wonder what we're going to do in the face of all that we remember." So many of the students would come to the class with a range of intellectual interests, but also political concerns. And so we were trying to get them to think in really interesting ways about the relationship between the university and the community in general, and then Columbia and its location in or next to Harlem. And this picture is, of course, purposefully taken peering down, right, over the precipice of Morningside to, in fact, highlight the ways in which, and I was surprised, to be honest, at the outset of teaching the course, that many of the students arrived with a host of anxieties about, we could say, falling into Harlem, right? And so how to encourage them to get out there and to explore, to think critically about the history and the present and all of the changing dynamics. But we didn't want to obscure that very real tension and anxiety in history about Columbia's relationship to Harlem. And one of the ways we did this, and here this phrase, mapping Upper Manhattan, it was a playful gesture. Right, so as one goes back, there are shifting maps of Harlem, right? Whether we are next to or in Harlem remains a subject of debate, right? And so to help students to understand some of the shifting political landscape, actual legal and policy debates about where Harlem begins and ends, but also the way in which it's a space and place that is both real and imagined. So the map in the left corner is sort of the quintessential Harlem Renaissance, the idea that in addition to the anxieties that is more interesting and familiar in our humanistic departments of sort of the Harlem Renaissance is this moment which Upper Manhattan jumps into the landscape. And then you see the map in the middle which blurs all Columbia and Harlem together. In the maps that we discovered, depending on the moment, I think the furthest down Harlem went was to 96 and Central Park West, all the way out to the west side, and then all the way up to the bridge. And so whether we think about Inwood and Washington Heights, East Harlem, where to invite students to think about the boundaries. And then also the phrase Upper Manhattan rather than Harlem was a nod to a particular African-American writer who made his home in Lenox Terrace until he passed away just a couple years ago, but was very much a sort of contrarian race man, if you will, pushing back against the nationalist reading of Harlem. I'm referring to Albert Murray, good friend of Ralph Ellison, in his first book, On the Americans, written and published in 1970, written against sort of the fervor of the 1960s. He punctuates his claim that Harlem is America, in this book, On the Americans, that black people are central to the making of this nation, by simply signing the book from not in Harlem, but from Upper Manhattan, right? Which sort of one has to understand the context in which he's making a decided claim to say this is New York City, right? It's not, there's no magic partitions in this space, despite how one imagines it. So how do we use Harlem as a lens into the American religious landscape more broadly? So one of the ways that we do this is by thinking about religious histories, right? And to locate myself in terms of my own training, I'm both a scholar of religion and race and American history, but my particular focus, as my bio mentioned, is on African American religious history. And following Albert Murray is a sort of simple claim, right, that African American religious history is American religious history, but not ignoring the ways in which Harlem jumps to the both international and American sort of cultural landscape as a sort of, often, if we look at the survey graphic issue which came out in 1925 as Elaine Locke and others were announcing the Harlem Renaissance, as a sort of sacred space, right? It's Mecca of the new Negro. And this is a volume of survey graphic which was this broader periodical that was chronicling a whole host of news in the 1920s, right? There was the New Woman, and in that sort of iteration of newness and novelty, there was the New Negro. And this became sort of the core set of publications for the larger 600 or so, more like 500-page classic anthology of the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke's The New Negro. Now, one of the other observations and sort of what we hoped would be an academic intervention was that despite the sort of colloquial or casual cliche that Harlem is overpopulated by churches and religious institutions, there has yet to be a sort of comprehensive chronicle of Harlem's religious landscape. There are some amazing ethnographies. In fact, Columbia graduate John Jackson at Penn has written several coming out of Columbia's anthropology. And there are a range of sort of focus treatments, but something of the ways in which the field of sociology has mapped the complexity of Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood, there's no such similar sort of chronicle of Harlem's religious history. And so that was the hope was to move in that direction, to begin to think about what that might look like through this course. And in this survey graphic issue, and this is the way in which the narrative of Harlem has followed a secularization narrative, a religious studies question, but also interdisciplinary, is that the one essay in this volume, written by, in fact, the first African American to receive a PhD in sociology at Columbia, George Edmund Haynes, helped found the National Urban League, wrote an essay, the one specifically focused on religion, entitled The Church and the Negro Spirit. And for whatever reason, Locke's aesthetic vision for the New Negro opted not to reprint this one essay that explicitly focused on religion. So we are following George Edmund Haynes, both an activist for racial equality within the Presbyterian Church, but also a sociologist attending to urban problems in thinking about Harlem. And of course, here you have some exemplary figures. Does anybody recognize the figures surrounding the issue of Survey Graphic? You can, sure, shout out a name, why not? Marcus Garvey, of course, right? Zora Neale Hurston over to the left. Down bottom, perhaps less familiar in the fedora, I guess, right? That's George Baker, aka Father Divine, right? Noble Timothy Drew Ali in the middle, sort of a forerunner of the Nation of Islam who had roots here in Harlem and in Newark. And then Mother Rosa Horn, who James Baldwin wrote about as that preacher woman who claimed him when he was a young teen in Harlem. All of these, another backdrop historically, figures are migrants from the South, from the Caribbean. So part of the emergence of Harlem is the story of the Great Migration, of hundreds of thousands of African Americans leaving the South, making their way up north in the first parts of the first half of the 20th century. And it's this moment where in the New Yorker, in the Atlantic, now I'm going to blank on his name, he was both a sort of radical activist and chronicler, wrote the book Where Angels Dare to Tread, right? Not just but that there's this special interest in these utopian, eclectic, unorthodox religious leaders who reinvent themselves, appear to come out of nowhere in the middle of Harlem, right? But again, it's not just a Harlem phenomenon. At the same time that Father Divine calls himself God and puts a moratorium out on the word Negro, refuses to allow a sort of racial discourse, and preaches a sort of new thought, metaphysical theology. As he's rising to fame, this is also roughly the same moment that Norman Vincent Peale is in Midtown, preparing to publish The Power of Positive Thinking, right? So there's an exchange of ideas across that 110th or 96th Street border that have a different iteration uptown, maybe. Religious histories. And then contemporary cultures. Of course, and I know Professor Tran's work talks about most post-1965. We can think about how immigration policy is central to what's taking place here, both when the doors would close to particular populations in significant number in 25 and then reopen in 65. And here we have images of what might be called New Harlem, a particular case of New Harlem within African American religious history. On the right are what might be more readily perceived as holdovers from a bygone era. These are two, on the top right, arguably the largest black church in Harlem at the moment, pastored by the unsuccessfully, pastored by Michael Walrond, who made a larger name for himself most recently by running for Congress against Charlie Rangel, and did not fare so well, but he now is church on 116th. If you drive around there or walk by there on a Sunday morning, you will find lines around from Adam Clayton Powell to Frederick Douglass for all three services of people mostly under the age of 40. Not a common phenomenon in most churches. And it's a very contemporary, upbeat, sort of new Christianity, if you will. And Michael Walrond himself, a native of New York, trained in the South, same institution as Dr. King at Morehouse College, but then came north back home to New York to pastor this church. And in fact, there was a chronicle in the New York Times of his congregation while he was running as evidence of a new church that was multiracial in Harlem. Still predominantly black, but seen as being more open and exclusive than maybe a historic congregation like Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of the oldest and most celebrated African-American congregations. Underneath is this annual street baptism service hosted by the United House of Prayer for All Peoples, which claims its heritage in the migration, being founded by Sweet Daddy Grace, Charles Sweet Daddy Grace, a Cape Verdean migrant himself. And they every year have these huge baptism services in the middle as part of a sort of parade and ritual festival in Harlem. On the left, post-1965, we have a Presbyterian Church of Ghana, right, as well as the Sufi parade, the annual Sufi parade of the Murid Brotherhood, the new Sufi Muslim community that has grown, and in fact, a significant portion is concentrated on the exact same block that Michael Walrond's church at 116th and Adam Clayton Powell, but that 116th often referred to, right, as sort of Senegal in Harlem, if you will. And then the Presbyterian Church of Ghana, part of also a new wave of more recent converts, more recent denominational formations in West Africa that, following a cross-generational migration since the 1960s, have now begun to institutionalize in Harlem. And both the Presbyterian Church and the Sufi community are part of a new wave of migration and mobility throughout the African diaspora. Now, very quickly, I see I'm at 1750, so I have 2 minutes to just talk about a couple of lessons learned. First, in light of our digital aspirations, my assumption at the outset was that students would be much more technologically savvy and would be well-versed in producing content for the web. I learned very quickly that that was not the case. Maybe that is old news. I learned the hard way, right? And one thing that came up, so on one hand, the need to teach those skills, which I know the Center for New Media Teaching and Learning here does a great job of, the need to teach those skills to help support that ambition or aspiration. Second piece we learned, closely related, and we shifted with our second iteration of the course, was the idea of producing a whole host of web content, and this is the question of quantity over quality. So we tailored it the second time to, rather than having students focus every other week on a different topic or a different interest or a different site, to have them dig deeply over the course of the semester within a particular site, to so venture more towards a social scientific, if not ethnographic, engagement with a particular site. Another learning piece, in ways I guess that should not have surprised me, this is of course Religions of Harlem. It ended up for many of our students being an intro to the study of race in a way that I had not, because there were no prerequisites. So thinking about how to do that sort of remedial, if you will, thinking about race alongside religion. Another question, I think, or lesson we're learning is how do we define religion? And there's a way in which there's an assumption that We deliberately construe it broadly so that folks just don't show up at the doors of churches, because that's sort of the most familiar part of they're the easiest to find. Construing religion broadly led to projects that might otherwise not have taken shape, some of which were exciting, others which were not as exciting, we'll just say. So we had projects on sports and religion, right, which were students very much interested in sort of, and we gave them the license to, if they could find a compelling definition of religion, to make a claim about religion as sport, and there is plenty of evidence to do the like. So the possibilities and problems attendant to playing with a broader definition of religion. And then I guess a last point, which I think is something that within the humanities, but more broadly, is an ongoing question, and this is the question of just simply writing, right? And so the question of producing web content was not just about tech savvy, but learning to be able to write for multiple audiences, right? How to please your professor, if there's one voice in your head, how to write in a way that makes sense on the web was another, I think, really interesting challenge that we're, hopefully when we teach this again in the spring, when Aubrey Hendricks and myself do this again one more time, we'll be able to learn and build on some of the lessons of the first go-round. So I will stop there. I've gone to 21. I think that leaves us with 9 minutes, right? Is that right? I'm glad to entertain question, conversation, any and all of the above. So.